Welcome to the ISO Show, dispelling myths and sharing tips for success to improve your business with ISO standards, with your host, Mel Blackmore.
Hi, and welcome to the ISO Show. Well, in the last couple of episodes, we talked about the new standard ISO 27001-2022, and we've been talking about some of the changes. An overall update on the changes, along with changes to the clauses. In this episode, we're just going to be talking about the 11 new controls. So they're the new controls that have been introduced in the standard. So just a quick recap on something that Steve mentioned in the previous episode. 56 controls have now been combined into 24 newly titled controls, and 58 of the controls completely unchanged, okay? But we have got 11 new controls. So it's the new controls that this podcast today is all about. And of course, I couldn't think of anybody else better to bring in to talk about this and to explain about the new controls than our very own expert in all things ISO 27001, Steve Mason. So welcome back, Steve.
Thank you, Mel. It's good to be back.
So yeah, Steve is a managing consultant, and he's put together all of the training materials for our consultants here at Blackmores, and he's also producing the content to go into the ISology Hub, which is our online membership portal. And it's quite exciting that the new content's going to be available to support businesses with the migration. If they want to do that with some guidance from our digital platform, the ISology Hub, that's going to be available from March. And in the next few podcasts that we've got coming up, we're going to be explaining how we can support with the transition to the new standard if you're looking for some assistance with that. But for today, I'm going to be handing over to Steve now for him to explain about these new controls. And also just to remind our listeners, before we hand over to Steve, is that we have been through some of these controls in a bit more detail last year when we were talking about some of the new controls in 27002, the guidance to 27001. So yeah, over to you, Steve. What are the new changes to the controls?
Right, thank you, Mel. Thank you. Well, I think the first thing to say is that with these new controls, people shouldn't panic about them, shouldn't worry about them, because they've really been introduced because the standard is catching up with technology. And I think in many cases, as I've experienced with some clients I've been talking to already, these controls are already being done by clients in their management system. The technology is out there now within the systems we use to be able to show that these controls are being addressed. So that's the first thing. Don't worry about the controls, because just look at what your systems can do and see whether those meet the requirements of the standard. But the first one we've got is 8.5.7, which is threat intelligence. Now, what does that mean? Well, it's about an organisation has to provide awareness of any of the threats that might be coming in their direction and demonstrate they're putting an appropriate mitigation in place to address those threats. Now, threat intelligence can come from many, many different sources. There's lots of online systems on place on the internet that can help you. You can go into the government websites like the NCSC, go into MI5, perhaps into the police websites for some of the general type threat intelligence. But also you've got all the tools that are out there that people are now putting into their systems where they can actually identify whether there are phishing attacks likely to happen, all that sort of thing. So really it's about an organisation understanding where they're going to get their information from and then how they're going to use that information to strengthen their management system, strengthen their systems that are currently in place. So that's really the approach we need to be taking there. And we need to think also that threats aren't just about computer threats. It could be about external threats, physical threats. So what's your threat intelligence for physical threats? And one of the good places to go is the police.uk website, where you can put in your postcode and you can actually identify the sort of crime that is happening in your area and when it's happened. So then that gives you an idea of if there are thefts going on in your area, that's a physical threat to you as an organisation. So you might want to sort of look at your physical security. So don't just narrow this down to system threats. Also think about your physical threats as far as this is concerned. So that's your threat intelligence side. The next one we've got is A.5.23, information security for use of the cloud. Now, we've been using the cloud for a long time, and probably can't think back to when we weren't using the cloud. It's becoming more and more popular to store things in the cloud, A, because of the simplicity, B, because it's much more secure than any of the other systems we've had in place in the past. What organisations need to be thinking about is who are their service providers, who are their cloud service providers, and are those cloud service providers built to have the security in place. We've got the big boys out there we all know about, and they're certainly certified to ISO 27017, 27018, and to 27701, all of which are sort of cloud-related standards in the 27,000 field. But there are also other possibilities of certification, such as CSA Star, Cyber Essentials, and we've then got SOC that are out there. They're all systems that help to demonstrate that an organisation has got some sort of cloud security in place. Now, one of the things that organisations can do for themselves is actually consider looking at the Annex A's and Annex B's in those standards I mentioned, like 27017, 27018, and 27701, and use those at Annex to bolster the controls that are already in place for 27001 2022. Okay, so if we look at those standards, I'll explain what each one is. The 27017 is the cloud security standard, straightforward cloud security standard. And there are some controls in there which are labelled CLD. Those are the cloud controls, and those are the ones that could be used to bolster what you've already got in place. There's about 12 of them, so there's not much more to add on to what you've already got. In 27018, this is really about the protection of PII in the cloud, but it's really from the public cloud point of view. So this is really a standard for all the public cloud providers. But there might be some useful tips in there that people could draw on to make sure they've got security in their own cloud and when they're drawing on a service from a public cloud provider. And then finally, we've got the 27701, which is obviously the PII security standard. And again, there are some requirements in there that where you have to ensure that you've got the security of the cloud in place. So think about all of those and how they might come to support you in what you're doing. So that's first couple there. Then we're going to come on to A.5.30. This is ICT readiness for business continuity. Now, there are a couple of standards around that clients might wish to go to. There's ISO 27031, which is the standard about ICT readiness for business continuity. And that's a whole standard that's dedicated to best practice. And in that standard is a brilliant plan, do, check, act cycle for ICT readiness in business continuity. And that may be quite useful for organisations to pick up on and perhaps set as their own cycle for business continuity and service continuity. What we're looking for here is if organisations have already got 22301 in place, they may want to see how the 27001 is fitting into 22301. So, and typically it might be that you've got to bolster up your disaster recovery plan in your 27001, because that's really what your IT is about. And one of the things they're implying here is that you ought to have a BIAs around your disaster recovery plan. Have you got that sort of thing in place? Do you truly understand which systems need to be up and running first? Now, that can change day in, day out, week in, week out, month in, month out, depending on what your organisation is doing. So mapping out a calendar of which systems and which services are more important to you over the year will help you in your business continuity. Once you've done that with the disaster recovery, you can then go to the business continuity team and say, right, does this align with what you think you have in place? And does it fit in place? And that's really what we're trying to do, is make sure that 27 isn't a bolt-on to the side of business continuity, but it is integral to the plan. Because what you don't want to happen is a disaster hits you and you suddenly find you've been left out in the cold. There are some examples here as well that you might be a very, very small organisation where you don't actually have the resource to do BIAs, and probably it's a bit of a sledgehammer to crack a nut. So all I would suggest there, if you're a very small company, perhaps of half a dozen people, do some sort of risk assessment around your business continuity, around your systems. What systems have you got in place, and what is the impact on you if a system goes down? And if you've done a very simple risk assessment around that, that will actually help you identify whether you've got an effective disaster recovery plan in place. So don't go out of your way to produce a massive analysis system that's not going to bring you any benefits, but do something that's appropriate to you as an organisation. One of the things they are also after in this standard, and if we look at 27002, it is implying that we should be looking at our recovery time objective and recovery point objective. Remembering your recovery time is the point at which you've recovered and you can keep going. Your recovery point is much further down the line when you've actually perhaps re-inputted the data that you were manually recording during the time of the disaster. So that could be several weeks down the line. Always go to the definitions in 22301 for RTO and RPO, because that's really what we're working to here. These are all in the section which is to do with organisation controls. So there's a few changes there. I don't think there's anything that's going to catch people out. If anything, the business continuity one is going to be the one that requires a lot of work, because there's going to be a lot of thinking around that, and it might be a bit of re-engineering of existing plans, but that should be fairly straightforward. The other standard I wanted to mention, in A.5.1.3, there was a standard some years ago called BS 25777, and this was a business continuity standard for ICT. I don't think it exists anymore, other than as a very old standard. It's certainly not certifiable, but it's a very useful document, some very useful information in there. While some of the technology and words might be a little bit out of date, I think the principles still apply, even 14, 15 years down the line since when it was published. So do look out for that standard. It's probably not going to be a full price standard anymore, because it's not a current standard. We then move on to physical. We've got one new control in physical, and that is A.7.4. And that is physical security monitoring. And this is where organisations need to detect and deter unauthorised physical access. Now, how many of us are used to seeing organisations that have got very good security coming into the building? You've got your access control, you've got your CCTV, and even going in the building and to offices, you've got your swipe cards into offices. But how many organisations take the next step and then monitor those activities and regularly review the monitoring they're doing? Now, we may do lots and lots of monitoring, and this is where an organisation's got to be clever and say, okay, what monitoring is going to bring us the best information? And who's going to do the monitoring? And what are we actually looking for? We're looking for anomalies. So it's not necessarily looking at all the information throughout the day. It might be looking for information outside of the normal working hours. Why is somebody trying to get into the strong room at 5:30 in the evening? And that reminds me of a very funny story where somebody was trying to swipe into the strong room at 5:30 every evening, and it turned out to be the cleaner. It wasn't because the cleaner was trying to get in there. It's quite simply that the swipe card technology was turned up so high that every time she walked past with her Hoover, it meant it looked like she was trying to get into the room. So, and that's the other thing to look at. And that actually was quite a good example of monitoring physical security, because they were then able to alter, the way things were being detected and just turn it down a little bit. So,
Yeah, thanks, Steve. I think it's useful to be able to share some of those stories because then it obviously puts into context real life situations.
absolutely.
It just reminds me that I just wanted to share with our iSocial listeners that we actually recorded some podcasts last year on some of these new controls in a lot more detail, and physical security monitoring was one of them. So I just wanted to chip in here that on episode 114, we talk about different scenarios and examples and what this new control means. So we published that back in August 2022. So that's episode 114. And there are also a couple of other podcasts around these controls that we produced around about the same time in August. So I'd just like to quickly mention those. So that was episode 111 on data masking, 112 on threat intelligence, which we've covered today, and 113, which was web filtering. So we didn't have an episode on every single new control, but we just wanted to dive into some of the new controls as they came out in 27,002. So yeah, back over to you, Steve. I just wanted to highlight that there's more information out there if anybody's interested in that.
Excellent. Yeah, just another thing I just want to bring up on the physical security one there is that don't overlook some of the perhaps simpler side of monitoring physical security. You've got to think about visitor badges. If you're giving out visitor badges, who's then monitoring them to make sure they actually come back and they've all been returned? And if they haven't been returned at the end of the day, who's then sort of disabling them and making sure they can't be used at other times of the day or even the next day indeed? So that's one thing to think about.
Yeah, I mean, one typical example is when you might have a visitor. We've had this with certification body assessors where they might arrive at 8:30 in the morning before the receptionist is actually working on the front desk, and they will just walk in without a visitor's badge, and they've been all day without a visitor's badge, and that's because somebody else has just let them in. So
Yes, yeah,
there's these sorts of things to be aware of as well, isn't it? So, trying to ensure that people aren't wandering around without the relevant identification if that is one of the controls that the business has.
yes. And actually, that's a very good point, Mel, because you've now taken that physical monitoring actually into the business. So it's no longer the responsibility of people in reception, perhaps no longer the responsibility of facilities, but the responsibility of everybody in the organisation. One of the tricks I used to use when I was an assessor with one of the certification bodies, I would actually remove my badge. I'd tell my host that I'm going to remove the badge, and I'd tell them why I was removing it, because I wanted to see who was going to be brave enough to pick me up on it. And some organisations were very good. You'd suddenly have somebody make a beeline for you from the other side of the office saying, sorry, can I see your visitor badge? And that was always a good check to see whether people were on the ball and willing to challenge strangers, even if they're with a host. So always remember that physical security monitoring can be quite broad in that sense. But when we come back to the system monitoring, perhaps CCTV, access control, make sure you're monitoring the right things and you're analysing the data that's going to bring you the most use in improving your systems. Where we have got a number of changes is in the technological side of the controls. And this is quite a larger area of the changes. So first of all, around 8.9, we've got configuration management. This is something that everybody is doing now. And it's probably, as I explained at the beginning, people shouldn't be afraid of these changes or these controls because they are quite natural. When you get your firewall, you configure it. When you get software and you load software, you configure it. When you attach hardware to your networks, you configure them. Okay, so there's lots of configuration activities already going on. What the client needs to do here with the assessment is to demonstrate what they're configuring, how they're configuring it, and then what reviews they are doing on a regular basis to make sure that configuration hasn't been altered or changed in any way. And don't overlook the configuration of things like passwords, because you'll set up your configuration that the password should be 10 to 13 characters long, upper, lowercase, and special characters and numbers. If somebody internally has been a bit mischievous and then goes in and changes that, you want to know about that. So there should be some sort of audit on that. But if you're going to do any audit on configuration, it should be done on the basis of sort of the level of risk. Or it might be that you've got systems in place that already do that auditing for you and are going to be throwing up some alerts to you. So again, rely on your systems to help you do those audits. I think we're moving away from the very manual approach now to auditing systems and monitoring systems, and we've got much more detail being thrown at us that we can then use to make improvements. So that's really what configuration is about. If anybody out there has got ISO 20000 as a standard, certainly in the 2011 version 20000, there was a very good section on configuration there. So that might be quite helpful if people have got that, and just to look at that. And that's about configuration of hardware and software between, other bits of hardware and software. So you can actually see a kind of a configuration network being built. And that's the thing to bear in mind. If you're using things like ServiceNow as a tool, that already has a configuration network system in place that you can actually see how all your systems fit together. And that's going to be very, very helpful within disaster recovery and in business continuity if ever you're hit by some sort of virus or attack. Then we come down to information deletion. Information deletion is really, it's already in the standard, but I think it's been much more explicit in saying that when you dispose of equipment, or if you're going to reuse equipment in any way, you need to demonstrate that you're deleting that information. Now, many organizations rely on a third party to do that. They'll delete the information and they'll also dispose of the equipment. But that's fine. You can do that. There's no problem with that. What you need to do is be able to prove that deletion has taken place. So it'll be certificates that will be required. And are you confident that the third party you're using to dispose of your equipment has the capabilities to delete, and delete to the level you want it deleted? Remember, there are many different ways in which you can delete information, and you may have a contractual requirement from a customer that it has to be done in a certain way. Make sure those contractual requirements are poured over into your system, and that if that equipment is removed, the deletion will take place in that way. It might be overwrite, it might be just purely factory reset, all that sort of thing. Just make sure you're doing the right sort of deletion for the information you have out there. And this also fits in very nicely with GDPR if you're trying to make sure that information is being deleted from your systems. Then we move on to data masking. Data masking comes in about 3 different flavors. We've got obfuscation, pseudonymization, and anonymization. Organizations are entirely left to their own devices to choose which one suits them most, but they need to demonstrate what they're using and how they're using it. And it's really, this is to do with GDPR. This is about protecting all that confidential information about personal information. We might find that data masking might come as dynamic data masking, static data masking, or as they call it, on-the-fly data masking. Dynamic data masking is obviously when the information is moving around the system and it's always being masked. Static might be that it's just one document you produced and you've masked it as you've gone along. So always make sure that you're doing the right thing for the right purpose to protect personally identifiable information or strictly confidential information that you're passing out of the organization. And that leads us nicely into the next control, which is A.8.12, which is data leakage prevention. Now, this was actually in the 2005 standard, slightly under a different name, just about data leakage, but it's come back into the standard, and I'm glad it's in the standard because that is probably one of the biggest threats to any organization is data leakage, certainly from people who are leaving organizations and they think they want to take a nice little present to their new employer. And it might be the customer database. It might be some other information they're taking with the organization. But a word of warning here to anybody listening to this who thinks they can take their customer database to another organization and just hand it over. You are breaking the law. Simple as that. And I've known a few cases where people have been dismissed on the spot for doing that. So not only have you left your old company, but you've now been dismissed from a new company in less than a week because you've done that. So I would just say do not do it, because you are breaking the law. Okay, it is classed as theft. So be very, very careful in what you're doing there. But what organisations should be doing about data leakage is, how are they monitoring large downloads of data? How are they monitoring large amounts of data being passed through the email system, perhaps to a single email address? How are they perhaps sort of looking for large amounts of printing? I know there are not so many printers around nowadays, but where there are, is anybody using a printer excessively to suddenly print off large amounts of data? It may not all happen in one day. It might happen over a period of time. So somebody hands in their notice and gradually it happens that way. But that's the examples of people leaving the organisation. We still have data leakage as well through other means, where we've got unprotected email systems. We've got poorly secured VPNs, other bits and pieces like that. It might be data leakage through phishing attempts. People click on the link, and then that enables whoever's on the other end of that phishing attempt to steal your data. So lots and lots of ways in which data can be leaked. All I would say is, if you want to look for different examples, just go onto the internet to find out what's out there. And then IT just need to find ways of perhaps blocking email addresses and that sort of thing, and perhaps make sure they're monitoring all the potential risk areas in their organisation. Then we come down to monitoring activities. That's A.8.16. This is really, again, to detect anomalous behaviour and potential information security incidents. So it links in with some of the other bits we've just been speaking about, and just making sure you have all the right sort of things in place to monitor any sort of activities that could be of risk to you as an organisation. So quite simply ask the question, what tools have we got in place? What things can they monitor? Have we actually turned on all the monitoring that's available in those tools? Because if we haven't, then we could be missing out on a very valuable tool that could help detect some of the risks and the activities that are going on. So make sure you've turned on everything you need to have turned on, and then look at what that's telling you and feed that back into your system for continued improvement. We come then to web filtering, A.8.23. Now, I know the web filtering has been around for donkey's years. Certainly, I saw it in the banking industry and in the financial industries when I was auditing them back in the past. And web filtering really is about making sure that people go to secure websites. So secure websites in the sense that they've got secure certificates in place, and those certificates are up to date, and they are, accurate to the organisation that's using them. It could be also websites, stopping people going to websites that are known risk areas. So there are those websites, we know them all, the sort of gambling sites and the pornography sites, making sure they're blocked off and can't go to. Because it's not just about people's feelings when you go to those websites, it's about the risk to the organisation that those websites bring, because they do contain viruses or are known to contain viruses. And there might be other websites that look very innocent, but have built within them individual websites that you can be passed through to that, again, unsecure. So it's really it's down to the IT department to understand what is secure, what isn't secure, and block them. And that might even be blocking some of the social media sites, because they're not always as secure as they seem. But be very careful with that, because it might be that your marketing comms department need access to social media. So it's not a blanket block. It might be that you have to go to some department and say, well, we're going to block access to social media, but what social media do you need for your marketing comms? And put some exceptions in place. Now, that might require a bit of training in that area to advise people on what to look for that could be a risk to the organisation. And our final and 11th control is A.8.28, which is secure coding. We had this in the last standard really under, I think it was engineering principles and things like that, secure engineering principles. But this has actually made it much more clear that we're talking about secure coding. And the type of secure coding that an organisation may wish to use is entirely up to them. There are lots of different versions out there. I mean, the most common are OWASP and NIST, but some people may have invented their own versions. It's entirely up to them. It's what's appropriate to them as an organisation. I would say that if you've invented your own secure coding, always evaluate your own version against some of the experts out there like OWASP and NIST and see whether you have covered all the potential risk areas of secure coding. But this is quite simply about identifying what you're going to do. Make sure that whatever you do goes into your secure development policy, and also people understand what your secure coding is, so they are actually putting it into any software development that may come along. So again, that's a control that was really in the old standard, but it's just been given a completely different name, and makes it more explicit that we are talking about coding and perhaps not other things. Because there may have been a bit of a misinterpretation in the old standard over that control. So that's our 11 new controls. There's a bit of a sort of marathon we've gone through there, but enough information to get people thinking about it. And obviously in Blackmores, if people want our support, we'll obviously give them more information on these controls and the changes as we take them through the transition process.
Lovely. Thank you so much for sharing that information with us, Steve, on those 11 new controls. I'm sure that's going to be really helpful for a lot of our ISO show listeners who are scratching their head and, I've got a few questions to ask about, what these new controls are and what do they mean. And you've helped to simplify that for sure. So, yeah, thank you very much for that, Steve. Really appreciate it.
Pleasure.
Good. So obviously we're running a bit of a series on ISO 27001 2022. Over the last couple of weeks, we've provided an overview on the changes to the standard. And obviously today we've been delving into the controls in a bit more detail. But please do join us next week where we're going to be talking about next steps for actually implementing the changes. So how to manage the transition. So there are lots of different ways that you can do this. Obviously, you can do that yourself independently. And as Steve mentioned earlier, for a lot of companies, you will have a lot of these controls already in place. And it's just a case of recognizing those and making other people aware of them as well. But in some cases, there may be a few steps that you need to take that you might be a little bit unsure of. And that's where we can provide support. So in the next couple of podcasts, we're going to be talking about our transition program and how we can help you, providing more information about the changes, looking at implementation, and then auditing against them to verify that the changes that you have made are actually effective and that they do comply with the new standard. So yeah, more information to come. I think I'd just like to also mention that, if you enjoy these podcasts that we're producing for you every week, we would love to hear your feedback. And also if you could leave a review, that would be brilliant because that means that we can spread the word even more. So the more reviews that we have, the more this show does get listened to. And we've got a global audience. We've got listeners from right across the globe. We had about 10,000 listeners in 2022, and we'd love to double that number in 2023. And the only way that can happen really is if you can like and share, subscribe and leave a review. It really does make all the difference to getting this podcast out to an even wider audience. And also, if there's any topics that we haven't covered yet and you'd love to hear about them, then please do get in touch with us. Or if you'd like to be a guest, you might be a standards expert on a particular topic and you think actually it'd be great to share that information with others that may be interested in raising standards in that particular area as well. So for now, thanks very much for listening, and I look forward to catching up with you on the next episode of the ISO Show.
Looking to use ISO standards to drive better business practice? Contact us at blackmoresuk.com to access further information and book your free 15-minute call.